Welcome to Wheels of Change. This week's episode is Epic Road Trips That Upended the World. I'm Amanda Gutierrez. I'm Vice President for the Automotive Restoration Program at McPherson College, and we're pleased to bring you this 6-week webinar series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, McPherson College is the only school in the country to offer a bachelor's degree program in the study of restoring cars. We blend technical and liberal arts education along with a strong internship program that really gives students the tools and the skills they need to be relevant in the industry, not just when they graduate, but also over the course of time and in a variety of ways. So we have graduates who work in shops, own their own businesses, others who work in museums or private collections, and still others who work for auction houses and other automotive related businesses all over the world. One of our graduates is our special guest today. Kyle Smith studied automotive restoration with a communications emphasis at McPherson College, and he interned as a student with 7 Vehicle Management and Hagerty. He's now the associate editor for Hagerty and uses his own love of learning to create content and to share knowledge with others who love cars. But Kyle also loves motorcycles and bicycles, and those are a big part of his life. If you follow him personally on social media, you might have seen one of his latest adventures that involved a motorcycle and a teeter-totter, but we'll leave it at that. That's for another time. We're glad to have Kyle with us today to bring his perspective to our topic. Our professor for this series is Dr. Ken Yon, and over the next few weeks, you'll get to know more about him. He's a professor and chair of McPherson College's Department of History and has taught at some of the top schools in France and Eastern Asia. His subjects have ranged from philosophy and geography to political science and, of course, automobiles. His keen ability to connect his subject matter to the human experience really makes him a favorite professor on our campus. But he's also a favorite travel companion to many people because he wraps learning and adventure and curiosity just into every moment. And I speak from experience on that. So here's our format for today. Professor Yon will present on our topic, and then he will be joined by Kyle to expand on that subject. You're invited to put your questions in the Q&A found at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can, looking to wrap up in an hour. So Ken, I think that's all I've got. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready to roll, Amanda.
All right, take it away.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a big event for us. We've been working on it for some time. And today we're going to walk down the road of road trips. And the way we're going to approach this is by trying to anchor it first in our daily lives and our understanding, and talk a little bit about history itself and how we understand history and our experience. And then we're going to turn to look at some specific road trips that were very, very important. So let's begin. Let me introduce just a couple big questions to start off with. These are questions all historians engage in, and they're questions that can really help you take the experiences of a bunch of people and make it part of your life. And I just wanted to say a little bit about each of these, whether or not history repeats itself, about whether or not history is a bunch of facts and how important are facts and dates, something about what historians call agency, and then something about multi-causality and the scope of the challenge that's ahead of us. For a long time, historians have been asking themselves if history repeats itself. And it's a question that I encounter often in the classroom. And let me tell you a little bit about historians, how historians approach this, because it tells you a lot about what we're up to these 6 weeks. Most historians are of the school that every moment in history is completely unique. It's completely special. You don't get a chance to replay it. You don't get a test run. You don't get a do-over. And that fundamentally, history in and of itself does not repeat itself. Now, on the other hand, let's say you're a freshman in 101 history and you get an F, you may find yourself repeating history, and historians tend to repeat themselves. But by and large, history itself remains a very unique and special place. And the thing that makes it a unique and special place is that the real thing about history that matters for historians is that it's not the facts that matter. The facts have to be right. They have to be correct. They have to be verified. But the real significance in the facts resides in whether or not they matter for our lives, how they tell us about the world. And the study of history is actually, if you think about your own personal experience, history is your first way of connecting to the world, which sounds really odd because most people don't think of history. Most people think of history as something out of themselves, something just aside from their life. But if you think about how you understand yourself, is you providing interpretation to the events of your life. If you get two people who go through the exact same events and same circumstances, they come out of it different because they're different and they interpret it different. And so when we look back in history, we see all these events because we're trying to understand the world around us. After September 11th, I remember everybody turning to the Pearl Harbor attacks and trying to understand the nature of surprise attacks, for example. Right around us right now, when people are trying to understand what's happening with COVID, I can tell you some of the very first place they looked was the flu pandemic of 1918. Not because they were particularly interested in the flu pandemic of 1918, because they were interested in what's happening to us. What kind of decisions are we going to make? What are the consequences going to be? Another place we looked to understand the COVID situation around us was to look at the depression of the early 1930s and late 1920s, because what happens when you have massive numbers of people unemployed? And so when we look to those facts and we look into the details of history, it gives us opportunity. If we're doing it right, it gives you a chance to look into yourself and find out things about yourself. And it's a continual process for everyone. Everyone is constantly processing their experience and trying to understand what happened to them. And so the skills that make up a good historian are the same kind of skills that can provide you with kind of a fundamental basis for how you live your life. And in this series, we want to look at these important automotive events of the past and tell how they're directly connected to what happens to you and me every day of our lives. A third really important thing to understand about the study of history is a term we call agency. And agency is an expression in history which simply says that things don't just happen. Things don't fall off of a table unless somebody pushes them, unless there's wind blowing it. And that's the same thing with history. History is something that's the result of choices. It's about individuals making choices. And, we know from modern psychology that people who have a sense of command and control of their life actually live fundamentally different from those who feel like they're constantly just blown about the wind of events around them. And so turning towards the study of history to try and look at exactly who made what choices and how did they make them. So many of people's lives are spent by following the trends around them, completely shaped and not feeling like they have agency or choice or will. But by examining history, you will find, and we will find together, that the people that fundamentally created the world were people who broke the mold. It was people who stood up and they said, I have an idea, I have a dream, I'm a vision. And in some cases it was against the law. In some cases it was violating the norms of their society. In some cases it was violating all kinds of principles, business practices, but they stood up and they did it and they created the world we live in. And you create the world you live in because of your agency. So the study of history can have transformative effects on the individual. Another important thing to think about as we go into this series is that when we're studying anything that has to do with humans, you have to keep in mind that it's a multi-causal world. In that sense, we mean that there's no one cause that explains something. Humans are so complex. We have so many different priorities within our lives, whether it's getting emotional satisfaction from relationships, of being financially stable, of providing adequate levels of security. If you just start running down, having an outlet for creative potential. If you start running through the laundry list of who you are and what you want from life, you understand quickly that there's all kinds of things that shape all of your decisions. And that's the same of history. There's a real tendency, because dealing with the complexity of history is difficult, there's a real tendency to say, oh, this caused that, and that's why it is. But universally, if you're going to conduct a good inquiry into yourself and a good inquiry into the past, you need take a multi-causal approach. And for the purpose of our webinars, we've simplified this title, 4 road trips that have upended the world. And I got to tell you, each one of these road trips were very significant, but they in and of themselves, acting alone, did not upend the world. They caused things to happen. They were part of forces at work, and they were like big nudges that shaped history. And so having a multi-causal approach. Another really interesting thing I think to keep in mind is about the scope of this inquiry. And I think very few people understand exactly how much ground there is to cover. And that in 6 weeks, we're going to like the tiniest fractional little slice that you can possibly imagine of history. I was thinking this through yesterday when I was trying to figure out how do I articulate that for us. And I thought, well, let's take a look at how many sources we have available. And so what I did yesterday is I went to the Library of Congress, and I went to their search engine, and I just started searching for terms. So the first thing I searched, and by the way, the Library of Congress is arguably the biggest library on the planet. I think there might be some that are close, but I'm pretty sure this is #1 library on the planet. And I went to their search engine and I looked up ancient Rome, and I got 1,767 monographs on ancient Rome. And wow, there's a lot written there. There's a lot. How could everybody master the knowledge of of ancient Rome? And I know we have authorities, and we have people who are widely regarded as authorities on ancient Rome. And then I looked up medieval history, and I said, wow, there's even more about medieval history. And you can see where this is going. 1,990 sources. And then I looked up the automobile, and I thought, holy cats, 30,000 manuscripts. And it's interesting. I met some of the people, and I've worked with some people, and I've read the works of people who are broadly regarded as the great historians of automobile, people who know more than anybody else. And if you talk to any one of them, all you have to do is talk to them for a second, and they'll tell you they don't know much, that it's such a vast arena of knowledge. And let me just give you some topic areas that fall under automotive history. Under automotive history, a lot of the books you'll pick up will be biographies. I'm just working through this list from the left side. There's biographies of famous people. It could be race car drivers or entrepreneurs, or stories of Ralph Nader. You find people who study the history of a particular famous car, and some of this probably, I'm sure some of you are here with us today have done this. You find people who are interested in a specific mark. They follow the history of a manufacturer, and even that history of a manufacturer can have all kinds of complex approaches. It can be a financial history. It can be an engineering history. It can have all kinds of dimensions. There's people who study the technological innovations, the advent of different ways of generating brakes, for example, or transmissions or steering. There's people who look at the elegance of the machine, the design, the lines, the artistic inspiration. There are people who are fundamentally interested in automobiles as a competitive sport. And F1 racing, of course, is the largest sport on the planet. Automotive archaeology, those who are, and I got to throw this out for a friend, and you know who I'm talking to, barn find. The barn find is an amazing thing, and it's about unearthing the past and finding mysteries in the world around us. There's the challenges of restoration, a whole body of knowledge that we specialize in at McPherson. If you think about cars and film, cars and music, how cars transformed the labor industry, how unions operate in the United States is all generated by this. Manufacturing processes, the advent of the moving assembly line, the advent of the assembly line are tied to this. How we fight wars, dating, marriage, how the financial systems of our country work, how the insurance industry has grown up, how we work with currencies and international organization between firms and international trade. These are all spin-offs of our experience with the automobile. Race relations, and we're looking at trying to understand, and we're coming to a changing awareness of the role of Black Americans in the world around us. I can tell you, you look back at the history of automobile, and you can learn some really significant things that inform you about the world around us today. Of course, we have ongoing environmental issues of smog, issues of climate change and carbon dioxide, international conflict about the sources of petroleum and the ownership of oil fields, national pride. What does it mean to buy an American car, to want to buy an American car? What kind of pride does that emerge, and why is that an interesting international social phenomenon. You know, it's the same for the French. They want French cars. Germans want German cars. This is not unique to the United States. We can talk about cultural identities and how they're expressed. You know, one of my favorite automobile phenomena is the lowrider. How cool is the lowrider? I mean, that's a manifestation of culture in the Southwest. We have mortality and tragedy. I mean, the roads of the United States are a slaughterhouse of drunk driving, as you all know. It affects how we plan our cities. It creates the national parks. At any rate, you can see this is a vast terrain. And so one of the things we want to do as we go through our content here today in the next upcoming series is to try to give you models, ways to do this on your own. And so, of course, you've all heard the expression that if you give someone a fish, they'll eat for a day, but if you teach them to fish, they'll sit around in a boat and drink beer. And so we're hoping that when you get done with this experience, you'll be better able to sit around in a boat and drink beer. Let me go through my notes here, see where, oh yeah, we're all the way up to my own road trip. I was thinking about road trips. So I was thinking about road trips, and I was trying to think exactly what do we have to learn about road trips. And so here's where I ended up in studying this. I ended up by looking at this, something personal. I went to a road trip that shaped my life. This is 50 years ago this summer. You can feel free to chuckle on your own. That was me 50 years ago. And my dad had this idea. I shared in my dad's road trip the idea. And my dad said, I'm going to drive Route 66. So we started in Chicago when we took Route 66 all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And there we were, you know, 10, 11, 9, 8, my brothers, and just piled in the Pacific Ocean. And it was a major road trip. But now there's particulars of road trips. But then now let's think about this as a historian. Let's think about what's the enduring nature? What's the phenomenon that while we have the particular experiences we have, what is it that makes a road trip a road trip? And right now you can raise your hand if you've ever had a great road trip. And I can't see any of this, but I know all the hands are going up right now because road trips are amazing. And I started thinking, and so I'd like you to, oh, I see hands going up. It's showing up on my screen. There we go. Please, you're going to shut down my computer. Okay, excellent, good. So I had to think exactly what, bing, 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 bing. Oh man. Okay. So I started thinking about what it was about this. It was how it changed my life. And I'd like you to think about that yourself, about what it changed your life. And so I started to draw some conclusions about road trips. And so one of the things I concluded about road trips is there was a lot of adversity in that trip. You know, this is 1971, and we had an old station wagon without any heating, and we were crossing the Southwest. And I remember my parents, you know, planning it. So we go through the Mojave at night, you know, so we'd lay up during the daytime a little bit and try and get some sleep, and then all the way through the night drive and dash around. And you had to plan where the gasoline was, and it was difficult, you know. And I sat in the back of the family station wagon watching the world go by. And you know, for your road trip, when you're thinking about your road trip, think about the challenges that you overcame. You know, and another thing, of course, my road trip had the Holy Grail, the 11-year-old Holy Grail at the end. Yes, Disneyland. That was at the end of the road. So we were like knights out on a quest for this great adventure. And then I thought about this also, you know, this is a real bonding point, you know, for our family, you know, going through this together. You create, you know, part of the way we connect each other is we create shared stories and myths meaning not lies, but myths being the stories we tell each other that are about who we are and how we relate to each other. And when you're thinking about your road trip, and this is really interesting to remember, you don't have to have all these components to make a road trip, but these are some kind of flexible components. For example, there are epic road trips that people do alone. You don't have to all of them. You can have an epic road trip that doesn't have a destination, but nonetheless, these are components. And the other one that I thought about for this road trip was about personal transformation, because at the end of that road trip, I had this burning desire to see everything. It fundamentally transformed. In fact, shortly after that, my hero, and this is kind of weird for an 11-year-old, but my hero was Ferdinand Magellan, who first circumnavigated the world. And that love and curiosity and admiration of Ferdinand Magellan transformed me and created part of my experience. So now, Let's turn our attention to the road trips that are our kind of the data, the information that we're going to use as we go through today's presentation. Now, here's the 4 road trips. 1888, it's Bertha Benz with, she's got her companions, her 13-year-old son, Richard, and and her 15-year-old son, Eugen. And so that's in 1888. The second road trip is 1901. So we're skipping forward a little bit bigger car. The driver supported by Ransom holds. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we'll talk about Horatio Nelson Jackson and Sewell K. Croker, and these road trips are becoming increasingly epic. And then finally, we're going to talk about Alice Ramsey and her companions, Hermine Jans, Nettie Powell, and Margaret Atwood. But to begin with, we're going to backtrack a little bit here and talk about the first car, because these are car road trips. And I want to introduce you to one of the questions that automotive historians often ask. And I want to show you how this illustrates something about the types of questions we ask and how we might ask them. And I'm realizing time is really screaming along here, so I'm going to have to make this kind of quick. I get kind of talkative sometimes. So at any rate, Leonardo da Vinci, you can see on the far left, drew pictures. And this is the first kind of self-propelled vision of a self-propelled vehicle that we have in Western civilization and maybe throughout the world. But somehow most people look at that and say, that ain't a car. And we start asking, what is the car? It's, okay, it's not just self-propelled. There's more to it than that. The first one that we know of that was actually built was from records from a Jesuit Belgian missionary returned from China, and he tells story of a steam-powered car that they ran in parades in Beijing. Nicholas Cugnot, you can see the second one over, had something called the steam dray. It was also known as an artillery carriage. And this is a lot closer because it carried passengers. The verbiest one, that little one with the steam wheel on it, it was only 2.5 foot long. So it's probably not a car. But we're getting closer when we talk about Cugnot because it had passengers. But when we think about the car, that doesn't quite make it for most people, because there's a lot of things that go in a car. It's not just something that can transport you. And our third one's a lot closer, the steam locomotives of Trevithick. But our first, the first road trip we want to talk about, I would argue it creates the car. The road trip creates the car. And the interesting feature of this is, for most historical descriptions, you'll hear the story is that the engineer created the car. Well, the engineer created the machine, but I think it's the road trip that created the car, because the things we associate with the car, the ability to hop in it, the ability to go, the ability to have an adventure. This is, of course, the 1886 Benz patent motor wagon. On the left side of the screen, you can see an advertisement for it. And there's one little thing I want to point out in this advertisement, because it says something about our road trip, the patent motor wagon. In the second line there, it says, mit Gasbetrieb durch Petroleum, Benzin und Naphtha, which means that the fuels were, of course, petroleum fuels, benzene fuels, and naphtha fuels, which were all distillates, fractional portions of petroleum. And you can see the ad there is very interesting. It wasn't doing very well after it was manufactured. I have a picture on the right with our own Chris Paulson, and I like this picture because you can see that it's a kind of funky contraption the more you look at it. I've had the joy of riding around that on our campus, and it's rickety, and I think the top speed is something like 5 miles an hour downhill. It's a walking speed machine, but at any time it just feels like something is going to happen. So it takes a little, it's an adventure just to ride in that. And I also want to point the picture in the background is a curved dash holds, which is our second road trip vehicle. So the story of Benz, good golly, how time flies. By the way, I'm a professor, so I apologize for how much I talk. The story of this road trip with Bertha Benz is amazing. And I like to tell it from Carl's perspective, because Carl's got this company. He's got, it's up and running. He's building cars, but nobody seems to be interested in him. And he gets out of bed one day, and there's a note on the dresser from his wife, Bertha. Bertha has a note on the desk, and it says, "I'm off to see Mother with Richard and Eugen. He says, oh, that's great. She went off to Pforzheim to see her mom. And Pforzheim's about 60 miles away, and she had gone back and forth by train quite a bit. And so he assumed that she was on the train. But what she actually had done is early in the morning while he was asleep, she and her two sons pushed the motor wagon out of the shed. They pushed it down the road so that when they started, he wouldn't hear it. And then they jumped off and took on a road trip across Germany to go to her mother's house. And by the way, this is also the very first stolen car, which I think is a nice footnote, without permission. So she goes tooling across in the countryside, and there's no maps, right? No pavement. These are simply wagon tracks that connects the roads. In those days, of course, rivers were a mainstay for communication, and there was wagons that used the roads somewhat, but they were not developed in any way. And so she had to fumble her way across the countryside. She went there, and as she traveled, the story spread. People found out about it. When she arrived at the end of the day at her mother's house, she telegraphed and said, I'm here with the motor wagon. He goes, yeah, I noticed it was gone from the garage. And then she says, everything's fine, everything's safe, that's wonderful. And she says, I'll be back in a couple days. So she spends a couple days there. And if you look up this road trip, most of the people, when you look at the road trip, they'll cite it as like a 66-mile road trip. But you have to forget, she drove the car. You can't forget, she drove the car home. So she drove it another 60-some miles to get home. And that leg is actually the big story of the car, in my opinion, because everybody had heard about this. And the role of women in late 1800s Germany was extraordinarily limited. When you got married, you couldn't have control of your own finances. She'd had a substantial dowry, and as soon as she was married, they became the property, the financial control of her husband. You couldn't have patents, you couldn't publish books, you couldn't do anything. And she had needed to have official permission to be on the road in this vehicle. And she went, this is an illegal road trip, which is like icing on the cake. And so it caused quite a stir. And so when she started driving home, all the media in Germany were covering. And when they covered it, everybody heard the story of a woman who'd taken his car on this 130-mile round trip. And all of a sudden, in my opinion, the automobile is born. That's when the car is created, because that's when people understand that it's something reliable, that you can get in, you can go, you can make passengers, it has utility. I'm going to skip over some other things about Bertha Benz. She was amazing. A lot of historians argue that in modern times she would have been listed as a co-patent holder for the vehicle because she had such significant contributions to the engineering of the car. But let's push forward with our next road trip. The next road trip we want to talk about is American style. This one takes place here in the USA. Let me do some clicking here. Here we are. This is the second one, American style. The picture on the left you can see is a picture of Roy Chapin, the driver. It was a 1900 dash Oldsmobile. Now the difference, the two cars from the same year, 1901, curved dash Olds in the United States on the left and the Mercedes on the right. And you can see these are dramatically different machines. And so the American automobile was taking a very different direction from the European automobile. The European automobile was becoming a handcrafted machine for elites. And there was a vision in the United States that the cars should be for the people. And before there was Henry Ford, who really makes the car for the people, this is the first car for the people. It's the curved dash Olds, and it's the work of Ransom E. Olds. So the story of this road trip is also very interesting. Ransom decided he was going to get his car to the New York Auto Show and drive it there. And so this was a 680, almost 700-mile trip that needed to be taken. So he got his test driver, Roy Chapin, in there, and this was transformative for Roy, I want to point out. Roy later on went on to fund Hudson Motors. His son became CEO of American Motors. This kind of solidified his experience with automobile and would change him forever. Ransom Olds also is the guy who puts the motor in Motor City. He's the first manufacturer located in Michigan, and he actually changes the automotive experience by selling a lion's share of the first cars that are produced in the United States. But this is another epic road trip, and one of my favorite stories of this road trip. There's two actually favorite stories of this road trip. One is that first thing he does is he doesn't know how to get to New York, right? There's no signs, there's no marked roads. And so he knows there's a road that heads towards Buffalo and up to Niagara Falls on the south side of Lake Erie. And so he heads off, I believe it's, yeah. And so he heads off across this road. He gets to Niagara Falls, and then he asks people, how do I get to New York from here? And someone says, well, I think you go towards Syracuse. So he heads towards Syracuse. And when he gets to Syracuse, there's this absolute torrential rainfall that starts falling. And so the roads are slogged down. He can't get there. And then he's talking to people, and it turns out there's a tow path along the Erie Canal. And he says, well, I'm just going to put the car up on the tow track. And they say, you can't do it. You'll get arrested if you're not a tow. And he says, I don't care. He rolls the car up on the tow path, takes off down the Erie Canal, drives to New York, arrives in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, just splattered with mud. And he rolls up to the Waldorf Astoria, and the people look at him, he walks up to the door, and they say, you're not coming in here. And they send him around to the servants' entrance. So Roy Chapin makes it into the service entrance. But this becomes such an important road trip because this road trip, I want to make sure I'm getting the right thing on the screen here. Yeah, because, and where's my Zoom window? Thank you. Because this would launch Oldsmobile. There's a lot of reasons why Oldsmobile was a tremendous success, and this was one of them. This road trip really illustrated the success. And here's a little numbers for you. 1901, they sold about 600 cars, and then after the word got out, and the prices got out and the engineering got out, up to 2,500 cars in 1902, roughly a quarter of all cars produced in the United States and sold in the United States. 1903, same to the 36, and then somewhere around 500 in 1904. And so he was the first manufacturer. He was the first one to use an assembly line in automobile manufacturer, and he was the first low-priced car for the people. And so that's a very significant contribution. Good. Oh my gosh, there's so many things to talk about. I'm actually, you know what? I'm just gonna give you one more road trip because we're running out of time, and I do want to get to discussion. So I'm gonna leave aside, and I really hate to do this, but this is my first time doing one of these webinars, and so I get kind of wordy. I want to talk about the fourth road trip, and this is one that's always been massively exciting for me. This is 1909. It's Alice Ramsey. Alice Ramsey got together with three of her buddies, and they just jumped in a car and took across the United States. And the Alice Ramsey story is wonderful. Her husband, John Ramsey, was a member of the United States Congress, and he was on a horse that got spooked by a fast-moving car, and he almost got thrown. He was in a carriage where the horses got spooked, and they took off, and he was almost injured, and he was afraid, and he was thinking about his wife, and he thought, well, this happens to my wife, this is terrible, and I'm going to buy her car. So he decided to buy his wife a car. Now, his wife was perfectly situated because Alice, interestingly enough, when she was in school, there were two courses in schools. This is the age of manual training, where the boys were focused into woodworking and steelworking, and then there was the home economics branch. And according to her grandson, he would later be interviewed about this, he said that his grandmother refused the home economics. She wanted to get in the wood shop, and she wanted to get in the metal shop, and so she was mechanically minded. And so John bought her the car, and then that summer she put 6,000 miles in 3 months. And if you think about the roads of New Jersey and New York in that period, not a single mile, very few miles. There was a total of 150 miles of pavement in the whole United States in this period. To put 6,000 miles on this car is phenomenal. And so she shows up at this endurance run, and there's a representative from Maxwell there, and he says, wow, you are amazing. Look at you behind the wheel of that thing. You ought to take one of our cars across the United States. And she's like, yeah, I'm going to do that. And she gets together friends. And well, she talks to her husband, and he says, well, her sister-in-laws, Nettie and Margaret, were very high society women, had never lifted a finger, had servants their whole life. They didn't know how to do anything at all. And then she's got this 16-year-old named Hermione Jans. Hermione Jans goes, yeah, I want to go along. Can I go along too? And they pile into this car, and they just barrel across the United States. And this is such an amazing road trip. They cover 3,800 1,500 miles in 39 days. There were 150 miles of pavement in the whole United States. They have no maps. They just look at telephone wires, and they figure if there's a lot of wires, it probably goes to a city. It may not. And she fixes it as they go. 11 flat tires, a crumpled suspicion that she tied together with baling wire, a failed ignition system that nobody knows how she fixed, a broken brake pedal, a coolant leaks, all kinds of problems. Sleeping at the middle of nowhere by a campfire in the middle of yelling coyotes. And actually, there's a story where in Nevada, there was a Native American hunting party with bows drawn who had never seen this thing and came riding up, and they wanted to know what it was. And they were terrified. I'm going to tell you, here's little book suggestions at the bottom. By Alice Ramsey and by Hermann Jans. And I'm going to tell you, they're also very difficult to get. If you find one, grab it. If you can get on interlibrary loan, you'll love to read. And the last thing I want to do to connect the dots is to talk about the world around us. I want to remind you that we're interested in things because they tell us about and what it means to be intrepid, what it means to be facing challenges. You know, Alice Ramsey and Bertha Benz were living in the world of men, and this is an uphill push for them. They're completely define what everybody expects about them. And as I was reflecting upon this series, you know, I thought this is a good time to tie together the changes that are happening in the world around us right now by looking at the green books. Now, the automotive experience, it turns out, is not just different whether you're a man or a woman, and a road trip is different. It turns on the color of your skin. And I was trying to find a way to poke questions at history. And what you do is you poke questions at the world around you, and then you use that as a lever to poke at history. And so I've got here one of the green books. These were published from 36 to 66. And these were road trip guides. If you were a Black American, this was a segregated world. And so I popped it open. This is a 1940 edition. So I popped it open to Wichita and sort of the Kansas, and you got Kansas, and you can see that. Does this work? Kind of not. You can see, maybe not. You can see that it has cities, towns, and then amenities. You could see that. And so I looked up Wichita. If you were a Black American traveling across the United States, here's your Wichita listing. Wichita, Kansas, hotels. 1. The Oklahoma House, 517 and a half North Main Street. Restaurants. 1. The Oklahoma Cafe, 517 North Main Street. And so it's by town, by city, your guide to traveling in the United States in a world of divided color. And so the road trip is not just about the past, it's about the present. And automotive history executed correctly can inform you just about any aspect of your life. I've gone way over time, as I do, and I really apologize for that because I want to turn over to Kyle. Kyle's taken the time to join us. And so, Kyle, there you are. Hi, Kyle. It's so great to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so Kyle, I was hoping that you would give us your reflections. Tell us about road trips. Tell us what you think about this content.
You know, I think there's a couple fascinating items to discuss and dive into on some of that. And you touched on it just a little bit. One of the things that sticks out to me as so significant in that initial Benz road trip when Bertha took that, you just touched on the fact that it was a round trip. And you talked about it a little bit more with Alice Ramsey, but the way that defines a modern automobile for me is because the inventor, Carl, built that car, and she took it somewhere for a drive, that 66-mile trip, and it was able to go back without the necessary repair, without the inventor and a mechanic needing to be there. And she did encounter problems just like Alice Ramsey in Maxwell, but she was able to overcome those with things that were readily available at the time. And so to me, that was the big turning point in all of that. Is it was a readily usable car that was not quite ready for complete public consumption, but it was so close.
That's right. I agree completely. Oh, by the way, so Alice Ramsey, so she loved the trip so much, she did it again.
And I still can't believe
and again, it. And again, and again. She did it 30 times. She was a road trip junkie. Isn't that great?
Wild.
So what's your personal experience with road trips?
My personal experience, you know, I'm a fan of the relatively unprepared road trip, which relates a little bit to a lot of these because they didn't really have anything to prepare for. But in this age of, it's so easy to go out and drive. We don't even need a reason anymore to just get out on the road. And so it's finding some place to go or not and going out and driving it. Personally, my favorite road trip of recent, I took a 40-year-old motorcycle, a 1977 Kawasaki KE-175.
Nice. A small motorcycle.
Small motorcycle.
Yeah.
Didn't need to be big. And I went up to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, so just a couple hours north of where I'm at here in Traverse City, Michigan, and rode pretty much all the way across the Michigan Peninsula. And I did all dirt roads and back trails and used a paper map because there's not a whole lot of cell signal anyway. Wow. Even if I wanted to navigate. And it really, that was such a time transformation because no matter where I went and whatnot, it was largely frozen in time. And so there was no better way to time travel than to do something like that.
I think you've really revealed something that occurs to me about one of the fundamental transformative parts of a road trip is that your whole world falls away.
Yes.
Your mundane life, the bills, the things you're committed to. And I wonder maybe if you can't do a road trip now the way you could, because a road trip was a practice in monastic isolation in some sense.
It's true. You had to be at least a little crazy to undertake it, especially in this time that we're looking at over 100 years ago. To go out and undertake something like this was, I mean, to even have the means was one thing, and then to also be crazy enough to actually go and do it was, an even smaller subset of people. And today, I think a lot of people look at folks that do trips in vintage cars, like I like to. This Corvair over my left shoulder.
Beautiful car, by the way.
Beautiful car, thank you. Is one that I've taken across the country a couple times. But people view that as a certain brand of insanity. And the reality is all of these cars, anything that we can purchase today, whether it's old or whether it's new, has taken some kind of giant trip. I'm not breaking ground by driving this across the country. And I think
you're breaking ground for yourself, though. But that's the point.
But there's a certain amount of comfort in the fact that people have done this before. I know that this will do that, and it's capable of it. So I have a certain amount of comfort that they just didn't have back then. They were doing something for the very first time. And so I can go out and I can do things for the very first time in a certain way, in my own way. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm not necessarily breaking ground. And sometimes it's fun to remind people of that when I'm out on the road or I see other people that are driving. They're like, oh, that's so crazy. And it's really not. We're not breaking ground by driving old cars.
I'm going to challenge that because it's your life. You're breaking ground. I mean, it's the pride you get from overcoming the challenges when you say, you know what, I figured that out. I solved it. That was, I can imagine traveling, on a motorcycle on these unimproved trails. It's like every meal is a consideration. Am I going to get food? And how am I going to get it? And you conquer and you achieve, and that's the stuff of being alive. And yeah,
for sure. I think one of my favorite things when I did that trip on the motorcycle is it has a relatively small gas tank. It's less than a gallon and a half of gas. Yeah. And so on trails, loaded down, I wasn't real sure what my fuel economy was going to be, but I knew I probably had about 60 to 70 miles of range, and that's really close to what the range that people would have experienced a century ago in the Oldsmobile, and what that might be. That curved dash Olds, you're not getting a ton of range, and there's an uncertainty. I've never been to the UP before that trip, and am I going to run out of gas? Not only am I navigating, but I'm trying to navigate based on a range that I don't know to a place that I don't know where it is, and that's the closest thing to time travel.
Let me throw in something about Bertha Benz. So there was roughly a 4.5 liter tank on that. And so, but it was a fuel reservoir directly. It wasn't an additional tank. And so at one point she started to realize, I got a problem here and I don't know what I'm going to do about this. And there were 0 gas stations, not one, However, these distillates of petroleum, one of them was very common in that era. It was known as Ligroin, and Ligroin was a cleaning used for cleaning dresses. And so about 30 miles, 25 miles down the road, I'm going to go to the pharmacy in Weissach. And she goes to the pharmacy. There's nobody there. He's over in the bar, you know. Yeah. And he says, you're never going to get this out of that dress, because she'd been on the road. You might as well get a new dress. And she says, I'm not using it for my dress. She buys the cleaning fluid and dumps it in the tank of the car, and off she goes. You know, it's just amazing.
And it is fantastic. One of my favorite things about that Benz is it's not a carburetor as we think of it.
Right.
Most people. It operates off of the fuel essentially boiling at atmospheric temperatures.
Yeah.
So it's running on fumes all the time.
Yeah.
And having driven one, much like yourself, you saying it feels like something is going to happen all the time is just spot on. It really is. And the process of getting the thing started and how dependent it is on atmospheric conditions and things that are out of your control. Yeah. Modern cars are just so capable of, and when I say modern cars, I mean 60s. Yeah. 1960s, stuff that's 50, 60 years old right now, is modern by today's standards, really, in the grand scheme of things. But,
okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Amanda. I want her to say a little bit about this, and then we should have about 10 minutes left to field questions and take questions. I had intended to have a little bit more of that, but we're figured out. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Kyle. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay, because earlier, I guess, participants couldn't see me. They just heard my voice coming over. So.
Oh, kind of like Oz.
Yes,
that's
right.
Good.
Behind the curtain. So, I don't know if you have a specific question for me, but we do have a number of questions that have been coming in that I would like to throw at the two of you, if you're ready for that.
Let's go that right.
Of course.
So, Ken, I have to say, do you have fans in every country? Because we got a message from a fan in India who wants you to keep going, and it is nearly midnight there.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so I think that's
an honor.
Phenomenal. So if you guys don't mind, we have lots of questions. I'm just going to kind of work through a few of those.
Saeed, is that Saeed? How you doing, Saeed? Go ahead.
Are you being funny? Sorry, I never catch on. Okay, so so I'm going to ask some questions. We have had the request that maybe we go over noon. I'm not sure that that's probably a good idea, because I know a lot of people need to get back to work and do some other things. But let's start with some of the questions, okay? Let's see. I've done, this person is from the UK. They've done a number of US road trips, including Route 66 in the wrong direction and Highway 1. Yeah. What would you suggest for the next trip?
Tough one. I'm actually a big, Skyline Drive. Skyline Drive. There's a road that's a state park, that was a national park that was built atop of the Appalachian Mountains. After the great success of Yellowstone, they decided they wanted like that was accessible to the East Coast, and it's got a speed limit of 35. It goes from ridge to ridge, beautiful view. Kyle?
Yes, I'm actually going to agree with that one. Having driven a little bit of Skyline Drive, headed south, it's absolutely gorgeous. Highly recommend it. It's well traveled and easily navigable as well. So that's an awesome recommendation.
Yeah. Let me give you another tip. Whenever I travel, I buy all the guidebooks I can, and then I mark the important places in there and don't go there. Get off into the little towns, go into the cafe, go to the co-op and have a chicken sandwich. That's where it's at.
I can vouch for that, because Ken and I did a road trip through Germany and Netherlands and Brussels, and I've never seen somebody treat a map with such freedom and disregard. Like, hold that map, mark it up, and yeah. So we didn't stop anywhere except Nürburgring, right?
Nürburgring was amazing.
Necessary, yeah. So, okay, I have another question for you here. What are your thoughts on road trips in the current selection of electric vehicles, and looking to the future of autonomous vehicles and the effect they will have on road trips?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's such a cool question. Kyle, you want to start, or shall I?
Sure, I have a quick thought on that. And I think it's going to encourage us, as autonomous vehicles grow, the network of what they're capable of is going to be limited at first. And I think what that's going to do is push those of us that might want to escape from driving with those or sharing the road with an autonomous vehicle to the roads that we should be driving anyway. And those secondary back roads that an autonomous car just can't navigate. So I think it's not necessarily going to change anything for the worse. I think we're going to have to be able to share the road, or we're going to end up with the roads that we want to drive anyway, between the two of them. In terms of battery vehicles, I think it's going to crop up a really interesting selection of things across the country, the same way that fuel stops did and rest stops and theme parks. Road trip destinations will take on a slightly different meaning because we're going to have to stop more often. So roadside attractions that have gone by the wayside as we went to an interstate system, even on the interstate system, we have to stop more regularly in a battery electric vehicle. So some of those things might return, which would be really fascinating to see.
Yeah. Now, I think the battery is undergoing dramatic transformation. And right now, there's a lot of discussion about, in the near term, having a 1,000-mile battery. And so that changes the mix. The ability of autonomous vehicles as software develops. And by the way, actually development of that software is so incredibly complex that it's not a done deal. The advent of the age of autonomous vehicles is not a done deal. But I can tell you, when it does arrive, I think it'll be driven by the insurance industry. I think you're going to have two rates. If you're going to have your regular rate, and then if you have an autonomous vehicle, you're going to get a lower rate, and people have moved to the autonomous vehicle for that reason. And you know, as I fielded the question of autonomous vehicles in my automotive history classes at McPherson for years and years, all I got was screaming and kicking. You know, this is like, no, don't take away my steering wheel. This is what automotive junkies are about. And I've always pushed back against that, because there's some reasons why I would want to, you know, browse Facebook on my way to work instead of doing that, or take a nap. But you know what? I'm a big fan of putting my nose against a window and looking at stuff. And being behind the wheel gives you a special engagement with the road and the countryside, but then the freedom from that also means your ability to sightsee. I'd sign up for it in a minute.
I think there's balance to be struck. Just, I know we'll definitely get to another question, but I want to work with that just for a quick second. In that, I think there's a balance there, and you hit it in that commuting, it is not like engaging driving. Most of our commutes are very boring, and an autonomous vehicle absolutely has its place in my commute. I would love to have an autonomous vehicle take me to and from work every day, but when I need to go back to Kansas for, you know, spring or fall, or for car show, whatever it is, I kind of want to drive that. Yeah. And that's something that's special to me. And so really being able to coexist between autonomous vehicles and driving vehicles, I think is what's going to be critical. And all of that comes down to regulation, which is, we don't even want to go there, I assume.
No.
Okay, so we've got just a couple comments I'm going to share. One, Kyle, a shout out to your Corvair. Also a request, if you would consider taking a road trip tomorrow to Pennsylvania to see some old friends. I'm guessing that is probably your Flatlanders
that has got to be
motorcycle team.
Oh yeah!
I think it's Evan.
I made it on. I didn't think you'd make it.
Okay, so let's see. I've got so many great questions here, but along that line, somebody asked, post-COVID, what do you think will happen to the road trip? Do you think we'll see a resurgence in it? This person is from the UK, and they are planning a road trip to southern Italy next year. So how do you think that will impact it? I know for me, I have the 64 Sprite that our students restored. They finished up right in time when we went into isolation, and that thing has been my sanity. I can get out on the road with my kid. It's great. So what do you think will happen post-COVID and post-isolation?
I have my thoughts, but I'll let you take it, Ken.
Okay, first, I think the road trip will be more popular than ever, because I think increasing amounts of people will be turning away from public transportation. And being on the road trip gives you control of your air and your germ exposure. It means that if you don't want to eat in restaurants, you have your your ice chest and sandwiches. It means if you don't want to stay in a hotel, you can pick your place to camp. And so actually the road trip would be a great way to really get control of your life underneath COVID. And so I think there's actually going to be a new special place for the road trip in this environment.
I agree. I think the one thing I would add to that is people look for certainty in uncertain times, which is what this is. And I know all of us are so tired of hearing the words uncertain times. Yeah. But we look for anything that we can control. And anyone that's flown or done any of the kind of mass transit ways, you're really at the mercy of someone else. And just like you pointed out, Ken, the ability to, you know what, I'm done driving. I'm going to stop here. I said I was going to make it this far, but I'm just not going to. And you have control over certain things. And I think people are going to really embrace that.
But you say something really interesting, because you know what? In a lot of ways, the road trip is the opposite of our normal experience, because it's the search for uncertainty in certain times.
True.
Which is a fascinating paradox.
But there's no one to point the finger at when things go wrong.
Absolutely.
You're in control.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've pointed a few fingers sometimes at people. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Somebody offered to buy you a beer, Ken, and then also then asked, and I'm sure he would you too, Kyle, but you weren't on camera at that point. And somebody asked, you're perfect, your ideal co-driver. But somebody else has now asked, 1 week left on Earth, room for 3 others to ride along. Where do you go, with whom, and in what car?
Ooh.
Oh gosh, we don't have another hour.
That's tough. I'm gonna load up. Oh, I don't know the car, but I would take my father and my uncle, who are both back in Kansas, and we haven't really traveled much, the 3 of us. But my father and I did a road trip. This Model A here was my father's. He bought it in '68, and we drove it from Kansas up to Michigan on a trailer. And I'd really like to do something in a vintage car with the 2 of them. I don't know what the specifics of that would be, but I'd love to go on an adventure with them.
I know what I'd do. I would get together like 50 of my best friends, and I'd rent 50 mopeds, and I'd go around to Iceland on the ring road, going from bar to bar, and I'd like call in advance and have bands set up. That's the road trip I would do.
I'd expect
it sounds kind of like a bicycle trip you take in the summer too. Okay, we are getting, let's see, lots of questions. I'm not going to get to them all. This was an early one, and I promised him I'd ask it, so I'm going back to it. Adam Savage of Mythbusters and Tested built a rickshaw that's pulled by a U.S. robotics dog. How does that fit in the is it a car continuum?
Ooh.
Are you familiar with it? Have you guys seen it?
So I really essentially took the Boston Robotics animatronics dog, and attached a rickshaw to it. It's self-propelled. It's driver controlled.
It has space to put stuff.
Is it a
You can
car?
jump in it and go. It's a car. It's a tricycle.
It only has 2 wheels. It has 2 wheels and 4 legs.
Yeah.
So this is a fascinating motorcycle.
Gyro car has 2 wheels. I don't know.
An unconventional segue.
Well, but this actually goes something to significant, because the car is as much a construct of how we expect to get from it. It's about us being liberated to move and travel and experience things. And it's the thing that those early steam locomotives that are self-contained that you can ride in, but it takes an hour and a half to fire it up, and so the car is actually significant in its most significant form. And I've said this for a number of things, is that it's a prosthesis. Just like an artificial hand gives you the capacity to pick up something that you can't. Sigmund Freud said we're prosthetic gods, and the capacities that we have in our automobiles are things that 400 years ago would have got us burnt at the stake. It gives us the capacity to interact and create and move in the world, to be creative, to be economically powerful. And so that's the car. It's about that capacity. And so I'd put the rickshaw into that bin.
Interesting. I'll accept it. I don't have
Okay.
any.
Yeah, there's some really good questions. There's no way we're going to get to all of them because it's 1 o'clock.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I just got going and
Oh, well, we weren't sure if there were going to be any questions, and then all of a sudden we just got flooded with a lot of great questions. And so, Kyle, I want to thank you for joining Ken today. Ken, as always, it's a pleasure. And what I'd like to do is just kind of close out, and if Kyle and Ken are willing to stay on, we'll finish up the questions that people have asked for anybody who's able to stay on. Are you guys good with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
After I get to say thank you. Amanda, thanks for the setup. Kyle, thanks for joining us. This has been wonderful.
Well, and I have my closing blurb I have to say too, and then we'll stay on for more questions if people want to stick around. Okay.
Okay.
So first of all, of course, I have to say we are passionate about the future of the automotive industry. So if you know somebody who is interested or might be interested in studying at McPherson College, please have them visit our website, www.mcpherson.edu, and check us out. We have virtual visits. We have socially distanced safe visits that people can come to campus as well. And once you are here, you will fall in love with the place. If you haven't registered for next week's topic, you can visit mcpherson.edu/wheels of change and do that. If you've already registered, you don't need to worry about that. And we will have Andy Beckman from the Studebaker Museum with us next week. And so I appreciate everybody joining us. We had more than 140 people here, multiple countries represented, and you showed effort because you registered to be a part of it. And so we really appreciate that. Hope we'll see you next week. And those of you who want to stay on, we'll hit some of these other questions. Thank you. All right, guys, are you ready?
Wow, I'm glad that's over. Oh my God.
Ken, you're still on mic. Okay.
Oops.
What is your opinion on the cannonball records that have been broken during this COVID time? Do you believe these records are valid, or do you believe the situational conditions make for an unfair advantage?
I think the whole point of the cannonballs is they're not valid. They're not sanctioned. They're not supposed to be. And it's by hook or by crook, and however you make it work, you make it work.
That's true.
And so
in an event that is notoriously illegal, doing in times that you have an advantage over someone that has done it previously is the entire game.
Yeah, let me rephrase that. So you're asking whether or not the cannonball guys broke the rules, right?
and people think they are.
Yeah.
I thought it at first. I'm not going to lie. I said it, I'm very much in the spirit of things. And I didn't think it was in the spirit of the cannonball competition.
There is a spirit.
There is a spirit of it. But I've since come around to realizing that the spirit of it is going as fast as you can.
It's outlaw.
Whether or not that's
supposed to be outlaw.
Yeah, it's the outlaw aspect of it.
Actually, this is the cannonball was the very first things I loved about the automobile. It was I don't know what year this was, and I think it was Motor Trend or Popular Mechanics. It was Brock Yates wrote an article about his run across, and I for some reason I had that magazine when it was published that month, and I read through that story and his story in getting a drive-away Ferrari, and the agreement with the driveway company was they couldn't drive it over 60 miles an hour and they couldn't drive it after dark. You know, they said we that was out the window before they got out of New York City. You know, it is an amazing tale of adventure and mystery and excitement. Yeah.
I think it's gotten a little out of hand personally, but I have a lot of respect for the people that are willing to attempt it.
I make a good effort that when I do stupid things, I don't put other people's lives at risk. Seriously. I have no limit to stupid things I do, but for me, there's kind of I never, ever, ever, ever drive with alcohol in a car, period. You know, I drive a little bit over the speed limit, but I never tailgate. So I do have problems with cannonball.
All right, we're getting lots of opinions on that.
Oh, well, mine's the right one, so.
You guys can go back through these afterwards and determine if you agree or not. Yeah, really wouldn't the advantage of the pandemic be just as much cheating as would modifying a car to need fewer fuel stops there? So there's lots of interesting perspectives on that.
It's a great question. That's a really interesting question.
Let's see. Some of these are just our comments that I will share with you all later. Thoughts on trailers doing road trips and going camping in a post-COVID world? Kyle, I want to hear your opinion on it. What would you think about camping along the road? What vehicle would you take? Would you pull a trailer or?
I'm much more a fan of using a van or self-contained.
Yeah,
notoriously, so Amanda made a reference earlier to the Flatlanders, and that's myself and Evan Clary and Casey Maxon, 3 McPherson graduates. And we gathered together at the Barber Vintage Motorsports Festival down in Alabama. And we did not want to get a hotel. We did not want to camp. So we rented a Penske truck. And I think they have given the deposit back, so we get to actually say it's a Penske truck now. We rented a Penske truck and we lived in the Penske truck for the weekend. And I'll tell you that was a great way to do it. I think that was larger than my first apartment here in Michigan, actually.
That was quite a setup. But you and Casey and Evan also were kind of the ones that started the trend at McPherson College of the van.
We have all owned vans, and 2 of us still currently do, and neither of them are me. So I have to
no. Van life.
But it is a great way to travel and be self-contained. You have a lot of space. It's very secure. A trailer is not cumbersome until it is. And if you're comfortable driving with one, it's absolutely a fantastic way to get around. But if you can go without it, you can go so many more places more comfortably. So I would always recommend something self-contained versus pulling something.
1000%. I agree completely.
I think I've got one more question we're going to cover before we wrap this up. What would you think of doing a road trip in a 28 Ford Model A?
In a heartbeat.
I would absolutely do it in a heartbeat. And if you are curious about undertaking something like that, Jonathan Klinger, fellow McPherson alum, did a project back in 2011 that I've always been slightly fascinated with, of the 365 days of A. And he took a Model A and we had an entire discussion, and I wasn't at Hagerty at the time, I was still in school. But post this, there was a lot of people at the time, and still you'll hear people saying that you can't drive old cars, you can't do this, you can't do that with particular era of cars. And a Model A's top speed is in the 45 mile per hour range, but you can see a lot of the world, like you pointed out, Ken. You can kind of you can stick your nose on the glass a little bit longer at 35 miles an hour safely than any modern car at 70, 80 miles an hour.
Yeah.
But he drove that Model A every day for a year and took it on multiple road trips.
In Michigan.
In Michigan, all the way out to Hershey, Pennsylvania.
In the winter.
To Illinois. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and he absolutely, it was a mostly stock car. And if you're interested in that, 365daysofA.com, I believe the blog is still live. He kept a whole book of that. I would do it in a heartbeat. I really wanted to drive a Model T for a year, but I haven't added a Model T to my growing fleet, as I've been hiding a car this entire time behind.
That's quite a fantastic setup you have there.
It's a problem.
I think. Go ahead, Ken.
I just want to add a little bit to that. There was a technological critic in the late 1970s who argued that the car was beginning to isolate us. It was isolating us from each other because we each had our own and we're traveling alone, commuting alone. But it was isolating us because of the insulation, the sound insulation, the air conditioning, and it was stripping us away from the environment. We weren't getting all the seasons. We weren't getting the atmosphere. And so you know, the vintage car is the way to really engage. Do it with someone, right? Have a road trip buddy, make it communion, make it special, and get in touch with the elements while you're at it.
And it's worth remembering, I know at least for me, I often think road trip and I think days and hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles. And the reality is that's not what a road trip is. Driving the next town over is a road trip. And so road tripping in a Model A just takes on a slightly different meaning, and it's at a different speed. And so you don't have to go out and do 1,000 miles. You don't have to do 2,000 miles or across the country. Just driving in your local area and seeing it through a different windshield and in a different car is just a great experience. It's a totally different way to see things that you've seen 1,000 times before.
Well, that's a great way for us to end our phase 2 of this conversation. And I thank you guys so much. This is what is so much fun to me about my job, is that I love to just sit back and listen to the conversations that happen around the automobile and the people who invented them and the trips we take and all of that. It's been wonderful. So thank you all. Thanks for those of you who stuck around. We had a lot of people stick around, and I don't know if our friends from India are still on or not. They may be in bed already, but thank you all from McPherson College. If you would like to register for next week's seminar, go to www.mcpherson.edu/wheels of change. Thank you and happy motoring.